Hey everybody, I'm John Luke and I'm joined by Jake, who just got back from Japan a few days ago because you were there to see Monster Hunter Wilds. You got hands-on with 6 hours of the game, plus a lot of time to talk to the developers. Jake, take it away. What was your impressions of this trip overall and the game?
Yeah, so I played roughly 6 hours or so, got to speak to 3 developers as well as the game director. And then they also gave a tour of the studio. And not only did they just kind of give a tour of the studio, but we also got to take a look at how motion capture animations are implemented in the game and also how they create sound effects and kind of build that sound design for Monster Hunter Wild. So it was kind of an all-encompassing trip that really let me kind of peek behind the curtain of Monster Hunter. But I think the thing people probably care the most about is the game itself and how it played. And now I know, a good amount of people have had a chance to play it because of the beta. The beta was a very, very, very small slice of what I got to play. But essentially I got to play through all of Chapter 1 and part of Chapter 2, which started in the location that I imagine folks are somewhat familiar with because we saw that in the beta. You could explore it in the beta. A lot of the marketing materials, a lot of the trailers have shown that area. But the second area we got to check out, which was seamlessly connected, was a sort of dense jungle area.
I guess I'm curious because so much of what we've seen is what has just been shown in that beta, that first area. We've seen like snippets of it in trailers, but I'm curious how the newer areas that you got to experience differ in terms of like gameplay and feel from that initial sort of like grasslands area that we're pretty familiar with at this point.
Yeah, so I think one of the cool things to point out is that you can seamlessly travel from one hunting ground to the next. Of course, you can fast travel if you want, but like when that area opened up and my camp was like, all right, we got to get moving. We're hunting down this certain monster, whatever. I forget the exact narrative reason why it was time to move, but you like actually take the trek, like some of your companions join you and you take the trek through this sort of narrow passageway that connects you to this other jungle area. I'm not sure if there are like entirely different disconnected areas, but from what I've seen, it seems like the world is connected. Even though it's not like one giant open world, it seems like a bunch of big open areas with passageways that kind of take you to the next one. I would say in terms of vibe, it felt much tighter, the jungle was dense. There was very different monsters and creatures, of course, roaming it to sort of fit that aesthetic. Yeah, it definitely gave a very different feel from the desert. It felt like I had trekked a long way. And what was kind of cool is, you have your camp you have a camp that sort of follows you around depending on what part of the story you're in. However, from what I could tell, that camp exists in both locations. So if you decide to go back to a previous area to hunt another monster, that camp is still there. It's not like the camp is only going to be in one place depending on where you are in the story. It's more just that it opens up more places and the characters you like will show up at those areas. So you can craft armor, upgrade your weapons at any of these camps.
So the open-ended nature of this game is probably like the biggest difference from past Monster Hunters. We've got to experience a little bit of that in the beta. How is that experience sort of evolved over time in the 6 hours you played? Does it feel like they keep adding new systems? Is it dramatically different? Like, I guess now that you've had time to like play it for an extended period, how does that feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have talked a ton about the seamless nature of this game. I mean, I've talked about it just in this video already. But I think the things that people may not realize that they may have not picked up on the beta that became a little more clear is that, first of all, monster fights, at least early on, seem to go by much faster. Maybe not much faster, but they go by faster. And this was something that the director did tell me during an interview. And the monster fights aren't easier. They don't have less health. What kind of speeds it up is the focus attacks. Because with this, it lets you pinpoint injuries and that does extra damage. If you use your focus attack, you can stun them. You can start hitting them with more deadly attacks. The idea behind speeding up these monster fights was essentially to keep the player moving throughout the world, It's no longer you kill a monster, you wait for the countdown, you go back, you craft. You don't have to go back. It could be a main mission too. Like, obviously there might be a cutscene, but after that cutscene's done, if the cutscene doesn't take you to another location, like you're just back in the open world and you can continue the story. You can hunt another monster. you can essentially do what you want, you know. But I think them speeding up these battles, I think works really well. Obviously, I only fought like 6 or 7 of these monsters, and they're all very early. I'm sure there's still going to be some monsters that are going to be, 45-minute gauntlets or longer, and you're going to need friends, and you're really going to need to plan it out. But I think like in terms of pacing, the quicker fights I think works better for this structure. On top of that, there's some other changes that I think kind of go with that sort of seamless open world. The first thing is like cooking has always played a big role in Monster Hunter. Now you can cook anywhere as long as you're not in a fight, I believe. I'm sure people were able to test that during the beta. I'm kind of mixed on this because it is nice that you can just cook wherever you want, but I do really miss those animations and sort of that like the event of getting a meal in Monster Hunter, like the Palico chefs that would make you these ridiculous looking meals. Maybe that's still there somewhere.
Right.
And then the last thing, which also may have been in the beta, but you can have backup weapons that you can keep on your secret, which is your sacred, which is your mount essentially. And I also asked the director like what was the thinking behind this, because I feel like Monster Hunter has been around for so long, and it's always kind of been about like, obviously you switch weapons between battles, but like everyone's got a weapon that they stick with, for the most part. Yeah. But the director had mentioned like, because of this seamless nature, you might come across a monster that like, oh, I'd rather have a quicker weapon. Like for most of my preview, I just used the hammer because I think hammers are a lot of fun. But there's definitely some really fast, aggressive monsters where you might want dual blades or something like that. And, if I wasn't obsessed with the hammer, I would have done that, but I needed to use the hammer because it's in my soul to use the hammer.
That seems like something that makes a lot of sense, especially for solo players, where you maybe don't have a party that fills those specific roles. So you're like, I need to swap between. And speaking of that, so when you played it, did you play it solo or did you play with a squad of people?
So we weren't able to play multiplayer. However, we were able to use the SOS system pretty regularly, which, in previous Monster Hunters, I think that SOS system has been around for a while, and that would kind of alert other real players to your predicament, and then they could join. However, in Monster Hunter Wilds, you can use these SOSs to call on NPC-controlled hunters. And I think when you call it, I could be wrong, but from what I remember, I think when you call it, they automatically fill up your party. So you have four people with you. The thing is that you can't like set out with them. So you have to actually start the fight. You call them in, and they'll be with you basically the whole fight. They seem a little less effective than real players, and I think that's by design. When I talked to the director again, he had said like it was kind of tricky to find that balance of like, okay, we don't want these NPCs to do all the work, but obviously for folks who want to play by themselves or folks who may just want to focus on the story, it's important to have that help if they need it. So what I would typically do when I was playing is I'd try to just sort of fight the monster by myself. I'd say most cases I was okay. Once again, I was still pretty early, but there were a few fights where things were getting tricky, the monster was getting really aggressive, and I'd call in my NPC hunters, which I didn't mention, but they're all characters in the story as well. So it makes sense that they're helping you. And a lot of times, like, their help just kind of came in the form of like, oh, they're drawing aggro so I can heal, or they're drawing aggro so I can aim for this specific focus point, or this specific injury. Or if I knock that monster over, then they're there to kind of like jump on it with me and sort of soak up damage.
Speaking of monsters, I do want to talk about some of the monsters you fought. We don't have to go through the list of all of them, but there's one in particular that I want to mention because they showed it in a trailer and it was like the coolest looking thing. It was like this giant spider with a flower on its back, and you got to fight that. And that just seemed like everything about that fight looks so cool. Like the arena looks like incredibly atmospheric. How was that fight? Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned atmospheric because the way they built up to this monster was also really cool. I mean, I know, Monster Hunter games always have cutscenes and story in there, but the way because it's in the jungle, when you enter the jungle, you're kind of on the trail of this monster for a little bit, or you're seeing clues for it. And when it finally gets introduced, it's like a very, very creepy, well done setup. But the fight itself I thought was really unique too, because whenever I think of Monster Hunter, like obviously there's been spiders or insects that you're gonna fight, but a lot of times you're fighting like beasts more or less. And there's sort of an attack pattern that you can kind of get used to. It's like, okay, they're gonna like swing their tail at you if you get behind them or whatever. But with this, it was very aggressive. It was very quick. It was like hard to predict because it was moving really quickly, and it had some really interesting secondary effects with its attacks. That was an example where I probably shouldn't have used my hammer because it had those like spindly little legs that were kind of hard to nail down. It was definitely sort of the standout. Like the whole mission itself I thought was really, really interesting, where you kind of pick up clues and then you see the monster and it's very unconventional, and then you fight it, and the fight was very intense.
I would like to switch focus to some of the sort of insight you got from the devs. Specifically, you mentioned they talked a lot about the process of how they actually go about like creating these monsters.
Yeah, so we did get to go to the Foley studio that they have underneath their headquarters, and it's like this tiny little room. It's packed with a bunch of random stuff. But that is where Capcom creates the sound effects or just about every sound effect for, I mean, I think almost all their games, you know? Like, I think almost every single game goes through that studio. Maybe not the same people, but like, I'm pretty sure that's where sound effects for Capcom games are made. But they were showing for the Ray Daw, which I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but it's sort of the featured monster, I would say. It's like a wyvern sort of thing. They created an instrument specifically for that monster that is like a PVC pipe that they've taped a mouthpiece onto, and there's like you can sort of pull it like a trombone as well, and it sounds terrible. But it is an instrument they created. I believe they called it like Murmurs of a King or something like that. But while I was there, they recorded that a couple times. They had a audio designer like quickly edit that, add some effects, and then play it back for us.
Oh, wow.
And they like essentially created the sound effect for this monster. I mean, one of the many sound effects, I'm sure, but it's cry in like the span of a couple minutes. So it was really cool. But one of the bigger takeaways that I got from it is like with Monster Hunter Wild or with Monster Hunter World and previous Monster Hunter games, they really wanted the monsters to sound like natural and real. So a lot of the sound effects they used were from real animals. However, with Wilds, what they wanted to do is make the monsters sound a little more, not alien, because they're not alien per se, but they wanted to sound more unnatural, more discomforting. So that's why they kind of created different instruments for these different monsters. And they also had another like weird box that had like a pedal you could push, and it had like a plastic glove that shot up, and it made this really terrible sound that once again was for another monster. I think it may have been the Lollabarina, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong on that. But yeah, they had like all these weird contraptions in there that they were using to make monster noises, which was really cool.
That's incredible. Is there anything else you wanted to mention that we haven't touched on?
Sure. I think the only thing, because I know a lot of people have been worried about this, are the bugs. And the bugs and the performance. So I played on a PlayStation 5, a base PS5, so not the PS5 Pro, and it seemed more stable than what I played of the beta. Obviously, I don't know if it hit 60 frames. I wasn't able to test any of that stuff, but it felt much smoother than what had been described to me from previous preview events. Not to say this game's going to be flawless when it comes out. It's going to run perfectly, but it does seem clear that they've put some work into the performance and the visuals. So fingers crossed that like when it hits the finish line, it'll be a very bug-free experience.
So there you have it. Monster Hunter Wilds comes out February 28th of next year. And for more on Monster Hunter and all other video games, stick around to GameSpot.
See ya.